Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because today we're tackling something that quietly undermines millions of people every single day constant. Self-doubt. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button because today we're tackling something that quietly undermines millions of people every single day constant self-doubt. And I'm not talking about the occasional, was that the right decision? Kind of doubt that everyone experiences. I'm talking about that relentless voice in your head that questions everything you do, everything you say, every decision you make, and even who you are as a person. It's the voice that tells you you're not good enough, that you probably messed up, that other people are judging you, that you don't really know what you're doing even when evidence suggests otherwise. If you find yourself constantly second-guessing your choices, needing excessive reassurance from others, or feeling like an imposter in your own life despite your accomplishments, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So why does this happen? Why do some people seem to trust themselves effortlessly while others are trapped in this exhausting cycle of self? Well, the answer is actually fascinating and involves developmental psychology, neuroscience, cognitive patterns, and some evolutionary factors that made perfect sense for our ancestors but wreak havoc on our modern lives. Let's dive into the psychology behind why your brain won't stop doubting you. First, we need to understand that self-doubt isn't inherently bad in small doses. It's actually adaptive. A healthy amount of self-reflection and questioning helps us learn from mistakes, consider different perspectives, and avoid overconfidence that could lead to poor decisions. The problem is when self-doubt becomes constant and pervasive, when it stops being a helpful check-in mechanism and becomes a prison that keeps you stuck, paralyzed, and feeling inadequate no matter what you achieve. So let's start with the developmental roots, because for many people, constant self-doubt doesn't begin in adulthood, it starts in childhood. If you grew up in an environment where your feelings, perceptions, or experiences were frequently invalidated, dismissed, or contradicted, you learned early on not to trust your own judgment. Maybe your parents told you that you weren't really upset when you were crying, or that something didn't hurt when it clearly did, or that your memory of events was wrong when you knew what happened. This is a form of gaslighting, even if it wasn't intentional. And it teaches your developing brain that your internal compass is unreliable, that you can't trust your own perceptions, thoughts, or feelings. So you start looking outside yourself for validation and truth, and that pattern persists into adulthood as chronic self-doubt. Similarly, if you grew up with highly critical parents or caregivers who focused more on your mistakes than your successes, who had impossibly high standards, or who gave conditional love based on achievement, you internalized that critical voice. What was once external criticism from authority figures becomes your own internal dialogue. And now you redoing the job of doubting and criticizing yourself without anyone else needing to be involved. Another childhood factor is inconsistent parenting, where sometimes your actions were praised and sometimes the exact same actions were punished, making it impossible to predict what was right. This creates deep uncertainty about your own judgment, because you learn that outcomes are random and unpredictable, so you can never really trust that you're making the right choice. Now let's talk about the attachment theory perspective, which is incredibly relevant here. If you developed an anxious attachment style often because your caregivers were inconsistently available or responsive, you likely grew up feeling uncertain about whether you were worthy of love and support. This fundamental uncertainty about your lovability translates into self-doubt across multiple domains of your life. You doubt whether people really like you, whether you deserve good things, whether you're capable, whether your contributions matter, because at a core level, you absorb the message that you're not quite enough. This is about blaming parasitism patterns develop from complex interactions, but understanding this origin helps explain why self-doubt feels so deep and automatic for some people. Moving into the neuroscience, there are some fascinating things happening in the brains of people with chronic self-doubt. The anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in error detection and conflict monitoring, tends to be hyperactive in people who struggle with self-doubt and anxiety. Basically, your brain has an overactive alarm system that's constantly scanning for mistakes, inconsistencies, or potential problems. This made sense Evolutionarily, our ancestors who were vigilant about errors and threats were more likely to survive, but in modern life, where most decisions are this hyperactive error detection just makes you feel like you're constantly messing up, even when you're not. There's also the issue of confirmation bias, which is a cognitive pattern where your brain seeks out and remembers information that confirms what you already believe. If you have an underlying belief that you're incompetent or unreliable, your brain will filter reality through that lens. You'll remember the one time you forgot something and forget the 100 times you remembered. You'll focus on the critical comment and dismiss the 10 compliments. You'll interpret ambiguous situations as negative because that aligns with your pre-existing narrative about yourself. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, where yourself generates more self-doubt because you're selectively attending to evidence that supports it. Let's talk about perfectionism, which is deeply intertwined with self-doubt. Perfectionism isn't really about wanting to do things well, it's about fear. Specifically, the fear of being flawed, criticized, or rejected. When you set impossibly high standards and your worth is tied to meeting them, every situation becomes a potential threat to your self-concept. So you doubt every move because you're trying to achieve an impossible standard of perfection, and anything less than perfect feels like failure. The cruel irony is that this perfectionism makes you more prone to actual mistakes. Because you're so anxious and overthinking everything that you cooey and think clearly or act naturally, perfectionism and self-doubt feed each other in a vicious cycle. You doubt yourself, so you try to be perfect to compensate. But perfection is impossible, so you accumulate more evidence for which increases pressure for perfection, and round it goes. There's also the concept of the imposter syndrome, which is basically self-doubt about your competence and accomplishments. People with imposter syndrome believe they're frauds who've somehow fooled everyone into thinking they're capable, and they live in constant fear of being found out. Research shows this affects high achievers particularly often, which seems contradictory until you understand the psychology. When you succeed despite intense you don't attribute that success to your actual abilities, you attribute it to luck, timing, other people's help, or just fooling everyone. So your accomplishments don't update your self-concept, and you remain convinced you're inadequate despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Your brain literally won't accept data that contradicts your core belief about yourself. Now, let's discuss social comparison, which has been amplified astronomically by social media and is a major fuel for humans naturally compare themselves to others as a way of understanding where we fit in socially. But when you're constantly exposed to everyone else's highlight reels, carefully curated successes, and filtered realities, it creates a distorted comparison set. You're comparing your messy internal reality complete with doubts, struggles, and failures to everyone else's polished external presentation. This makes you feel like everyone else has it figured out, while you read the only one who doesn't, which reinforces self-doubt. The truth is, most of those people are probably doubting themselves too. But you never see that part. The comparison trap makes you doubt your worth, your progress, your choices, because there's always someone who appears to be doing it better. Another factor is decision fatigue and information overload in modern life. We make more choices in a day than our ancestors made in a month, and we have access to unlimited information about every possible option. This abundance of choice and information can actually paralyze decision-making and increase self-doubt because there are always more angles to consider, more potential consequences to worry about, more data that might change your mind. Your brain gets overwhelmed trying to process it all, so you doubt whether you've considered enough information, whether you're missing something crucial, whether you're qualified to make this decision at all. It's analysis paralysis, driven by the cognitive burden of modern complexity. Let's talk about the role of anxiety more broadly, because self-doubt and anxiety are deeply connected. Anxiety makes you perceive the world as more threatening and uncertain than it actually is, which naturally generates doubt about your ability to handle situations. When your baseline is anxious, you don't trust that things will work out. You don't trust that you can cope with challenges, and you don't trust your own judgment about safety versus danger. The physical symptoms of anxiety: racing heart, tight chest, shaking. A scan also creates self-doubt because your body is sending signals of distress, which your brain interprets as evidence that something is genuinely wrong, even when the threat is just your anxious thoughts. There's also learned helplessness, which is a psychological phenomenon where repeated experiences of failure or lack of control teach you that your actions do matter. If you've been in situations where nothing you did seemed to work, where outcomes felt random regardless of your efforts, or where you had no agency, you can develop a generalized belief that you're ineffective. This creates profound self-doubt because you've learned that trusting yourself or your capabilities is pointless. Things happen to you rather than being influenced by you. Breaking out of learned helplessness requires rebuilding the connection between your actions and outcomes, which takes time and often professional support. Here's something really important. Self-doubt often masquerades as humility or realism, which makes it harder to recognize and challenge. You might think I'm not being arrogant. I'm just being realistic about my limitations, or it is healthy to question myself rather than being overconfident. And while there's truth to the value of humility and chronic self-doubt goes way beyond that into territory that's actively harmful. True humility means acknowledging both your strengths and limitations accurately, while self-doubt means systematically underestimating your capabilities and overestimating your flaws. If your self-assessment is constantly skewed negative, and your doubt prevents you from taking appropriate action or accepting your accomplishments, that's not humility. That's a cognitive distortion that needs addressing. So what can you do about constant self-doubt? First, recognize that this is a character flaw or permanent personality trait. It's a learned pattern that can be unlearned. Therapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, can be incredibly helpful for identifying and challenging the distorted thought patterns that fuel working with your inner critic by naming it, recognizing when it's speaking, and consciously choosing not to believe everything it says is powerful. Building self-compassion through practices that treat yourself with the same kindness you offer. A good friend can counteract years of harsh self-judgment. Taking action despite doubt rather than waiting until doubt disappears is crucial because confidence comes from doing, not from feeling ready. Limiting social comparison by being intentional about social media use, and remembering that you're recomparing your insides to everyone else's outsides helps maintain perspective. And celebrating small wins, keeping evidence of your competence and past successes, and actively practicing trusting yourself in low-stakes situations can gradually rebuild your internal compass. If this video resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need this message. Because self-doubt is incredibly common but rarely talked about honestly. Drop a comment, letting me know what triggers your self-doubt most. I read every comment and I am genuinely curious about your experiences. And remember, doubting yourself doesn't make you weak or broken. It makes you human, and it's something you can absolutely work through with the right understanding and tools. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.